the blood wouldn't stop. That was the first thing Mabel noticed when she pushed through the heavy oak door of the inn's back corridor. The sharp, metallic smell cutting through the familiar warmth of roasting meat and pine smoke. She had been carrying a tray of ale mugs toward table 7 when the commotion erupted from the private hall, and now she stood frozen in the narrow passage, her worn leather boots planted on cold stone, watching 3 royal guards drag a man through the side entrance with the kind of urgency that meant someone important was dying. She pressed herself against the wall to let them pass. The man they carried was enormous. Even slumped between 2 guards, his frame was broad, his shoulders nearly spanning the width of the corridor. His dark hair was matted against his forehead, and the left side of his tunic, deep charcoal wool, finely stitched, clearly expensive, was soaked black with blood. A 4th guard followed behind, barking orders in a low, clipped voice at a trembling boy who looked no older than 16. Move the tables. Clear the main hall. Send for Healer Drost immediately. Mabel flattened herself further against the stone wall, the tray pressed into her ribs. She recognized the silver insignia on the guard's chest plates, a wolf mid-howl, crowned in iron, and her stomach dropped quietly. The king's men. She didn't look directly at the wounded man's face. In her experience, looking too long at powerful men only brought trouble. She kept her eyes down and waited for them to pass, already calculating how quickly she could return to table 7 before old Garrett started complaining about his ale going warm. But the trembling boy stopped in front of her. You, his voice cracked on the single syllable. You work here? Mabel looked up slowly. The boy's face was pale as birchwood, his eyes too wide. I serve tables, she said carefully. Is there a back room? A quiet room? Somewhere clean? She glanced past him at the wounded man. Up close, the blood loss was worse than she'd first thought. The way his head hung, not entirely unconscious, but not fully present either. The shallow pull of breath through his nose, the particular gray color beginning to creep beneath his jaw. She had seen that color before. The storage room, she said. 2nd door on the left. The table in there is sturdy. The boy nodded and ran ahead to open it. She should have gone back to table 7. She knew that. Instead, her feet moved of their own accord, following the group into the storage room because something in the tilt of the wounded man's neck told her they were about to lay him down at the wrong angle, and that would make the bleeding worse. Stop. The word came out of her before she could think better of it. All 4 guards turned to look at her. She set her tray down on a barrel, crossed the small room in 3 steps, and repositioned the sack of grain someone had already shoved beneath the man's head, raising it slightly, tilting it just enough to ease the strain on the left side of his throat where the wound clearly originated. Then she stepped back and picked up her tray again. The largest guard, a man with a jaw like an anvil and eyes like cold river stones, stared at her for a long moment. Who are you? He said. Mabel. I serve tables. Why did you do that? She looked at the angle of the wound, the faint blue tinge beginning at the man's fingertips. Because the way you had his head would have put pressure on the wrong vein, and he would have been dead before your healer arrived. She paused. That's all. She turned to leave. The wounded man's hand shot out and closed around her wrist. The grip was impossibly strong for someone half-conscious. Mabel went still. She didn't pull away. She'd learned long ago that pulling away from a trapped grip only tightened it. Slowly, she turned back. His eyes were open. They were the color of storm clouds shot through with amber, not quite gray, not quite gold, something between the two, something that seemed to shift as she looked at them. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pain, not fear. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. Don't go, he said. His voice was low, rough, the texture of gravel under boot leather. The room had gone very still. Mabel looked down at her wrist in his hand. She looked back at his face. She had no idea who this man was beyond the evidence of his guards and his ruined expensive tunic, and the way every person in the room seemed to hold their breath waiting for him to speak. "I'm a waitress," she told him, very clearly and very calmly. "Not a healer." The corner of his cracked lips moved. It might have been the beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know," he said, and then his eyes closed again. By the time Healer Drost arrived, Mabel had returned to table 7. She refilled Garrett's ale without being asked, collected 3 empty bowls from the far table, and made herself busy in the practiced way she had perfected over 4 years of working at the Iron Bell Inn. Invisible when she needed to be, efficient always, careful never to take up more space than required. She did not think about the man in the storage room. She told herself that twice, which meant she was thinking about him constantly. The Iron Bell sat at the edge of Crestfall, a market town perched in the valley between 2 mountain ridges, where the wind never quite stopped, and the winters lasted 4 months longer than anywhere sensible. It was not a glamorous posting for a woman of 24, but Mabel had learned to measure her life by different standards than glamour. She had a small room above the kitchen, a wool blanket thick enough for the cold, enough coin at the end of each week to eat properly, and a reputation among the regular customers as someone who didn't cause problems. That last one was the most valuable. She was refilling the breadbasket at the counter when she heard the argument begin in the private hall. She wasn't meant to hear it. The door was nearly closed. But the Iron Bell's walls were old and thin, and Mabel had very good ears, a fact she had always kept to herself. "The wound won't close." Healer Drost's voice, strained and high. "I've applied the silver root twice. It should have worked by now." "Then apply it again." The guard with the anvil jaw. "It won't matter. Something in this wound resists the compound. I've never seen—" "You're the finest healer in the province." "I know what I am." A pause. Cloth rustling. "And I'm telling you, I don't know what this is." Mabel set down the breadbasket. She thought about the angle of the wound. She thought about the color at his fingertips. She thought about a woman she had known a long time ago. Not a healer, not officially, never with a title, who had taught her that sometimes the body's refusal to close was not about the wound at all, but about what the wound had been made with. She thought about that for approximately 30 seconds. Then she untied her apron, folded it neatly over the counter, and walked to the private hall. The guard at the door put one hand on her shoulder before she could knock. "Not your business," he said. "I know," Mabel agreed. "Is he still bleeding?" The guard's jaw tightened. "Let her in." The voice came from inside, the rough gravel voice she had only heard one sentence from, but somehow already recognized. Quieter now, more strained, but still carrying an authority that didn't require volume. The guard moved aside, not happily. Mabel walked in. The storage room smelled of iron and pine resin, and the sharp, acrid bite of silver root compound burning uselessly against skin that wouldn't accept it. Healer Drost stood beside the makeshift table, an older man, neatly dressed, with the particular expression of a competent person, confronting something outside their competence. He looked at Mabel the way people looked at unexpected weather, uncertain whether to be relieved or offended. The man on the table had his eyes open again. She crossed the room without asking permission, which she suspected was either the right instinct or a catastrophic mistake. She looked at the wound properly for the first time. Long, clean on one edge, ragged on the other, made by something that started sharp and ended broken. "What did this?" she asked. "That's not your concern." "The guard again. A cursed blade," the man on the table said. His eyes were on her face. "Ash iron, wrapped." Healer Drost made a sharp sound. "That's not possible. Ash iron hasn't been— I know what cut me." Mabel nodded slowly. She looked around the room, storage, grain sacks, oil jars, dried herbs hanging from the low beam. Her eyes found what she needed in approximately 10 seconds. She moved to the hanging bundles, selected 2, moved to the oil shelf, uncorked a small jar and smelled it, replaced it, took the next one. "What are you doing?" Drost demanded. "The silver root won't work on an ash iron wound," Mabel said, not unkindly. "It feeds on compound-based medicine. The more you apply, the more it resists." She was already working, hands moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than this. "You need to neutralize the curse first. Then the wound closes on its own." Silence. She worked for 1 minute, perhaps a little less. When she stepped back, the wound had closed. Not healed. It would scar, and the skin around it was still angry red. But the bleeding had stopped completely, and the blue had already begun to retreat from his fingertips, color returning in a slow, quiet tide. Healer Drost stared. The guard stared. The man on the table looked at his own hand, the one that had gripped her wrist, and then looked at Mabel with that same unnamed expression from before. That quiet, unsettling thing that wasn't pain and wasn't fear. 25 healers, the guard with the anvil jaw said. His voice had changed entirely. "In 3 kingdoms, for 6 days. Mabel picked up her 2 borrowed herbs and set them back on the shelf where she'd found them. "Then they were all using the wrong compound," she said simply. She turned to leave. "Mabel." She stopped. The man on the table, the man whose name she still did not know, whose face she had been carefully not memorizing, whose grip she could still feel faintly around her wrist, said her name as though he had already been carrying it for some time. "Sit down," he said. "Please." It was the please that stopped her completely. In her experience, men who traveled with 4 armed guards and silver insignia and fine charcoal wool did not say please to waitresses in storage rooms. She turned back around. "I still have tables to serve," she said. "I know." And something in his storm and amber eyes shifted. "I'll wait." She finished her tables. It took another hour. The dinner crowd at the Iron Bell didn't thin until the candles on the far wall burned down to their 2nd mark. And Mabel moved through it with her usual steadiness, refilling mugs, carrying bowls of lamb stew through the smoky warmth of the main hall, nodding at the regulars who called her by name. Old Garrett finally stopped complaining about his ale. The baker's wife from the north end of town laughed too loudly at something her husband said. The fire in the great hearth crackled and spat pine resin into the air, and the smell of it mixed with the bread smell and the wool smell of damp cloaks hung near the door, and it was all exactly as it always was. Except that there were 2 royal guards standing at the entrance to the private hall, and Mabel could feel, in the particular way she had learned to sense things without looking directly at them, that the man inside was still awake, still waiting. When she finally untied her apron for the 2nd time that evening and folded it over the counter, Petra, the inn's other waitress, a broad-shouldered woman of 30 who had seen everything twice and was surprised by nothing, leaned over and said quietly, "You know who that is in the back room, don't you?" Mabel looked at her. "The Alpha King," Petra said, flat, matter of fact, the way she might say the well's gone dry again, or frost came early this year. "Aiden of the Iron Veil. They say he hasn't been seen in public in 6 days. They say he was dying." She paused. "They say he still might be." Mabel said nothing. "The guard asked Rolf about you," Petra continued, meaning the innkeeper. "Name, history, how long you've worked here." She tilted her head. "Rolf told him 4 years, no trouble, good worker. Didn't say much else because Rolf doesn't know much else." "That's accurate," Mabel said. Petra looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression she reserved for things she had decided not to push on. Then she picked up her own apron and hung it on the hook by the kitchen door. "Be careful," she said simply. and went upstairs. Mabel stood alone at the counter for a moment. The fire had burned lower. The last customers were pulling on their cloaks near the door. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the shuttered windows with a low, persistent sound, like something asking to be let in. She walked to the private hall. He was sitting up. Someone had found him a clean shirt, linen, undyed, clearly borrowed from whatever the inn had available, which meant it was slightly too short in the arms and pulling at the shoulders. The charcoal wool tunic had been folded and set aside, dark stains and all. His feet were on the floor. He was holding a cup of water that one of the guards must have brought, and he was looking at the low beam above the table as though it had said something worth considering. The guard with the anvil jaw, she had learned from Petra that his name was Castor, stood in the corner with his arms crossed and his eyes on Mabel the moment she entered. Not hostile exactly, evaluating. The way a man evaluates a door he isn't sure should be opened. The boy who had first stopped her in the corridor was sitting on a grain sack near the wall, half asleep, his chin dropping toward his chest. He couldn't have been more than 16. He had the look of someone who had not slept properly in several days. Aiden, the Alpha King, a title that still felt slightly unreal in Mabel's mind, like a word in a language she understood individually but not in combination, looked at her when she came in. The storm and amber eyes were clearer now, more present. Whatever had been pulling him under before had retreated, at least temporarily. And what remained was a gaze that was direct and unhurried and faintly unsettling in the way that very still water was unsettling. You couldn't always tell how deep it ran. "You stayed," he said. "You asked me to." "People don't always do what I ask." The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost thing that wasn't quite a smile. "Even when I say please." Mabel pulled a low stool from beside the wall and sat on it, which seemed to mildly surprise him. She suspected most people either stood at attention or dropped into chairs with elaborate deference. She just sat, the way she would sit anywhere, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. "How does your side feel?" she asked. "Better than it did this morning." He set the water cup down. "Where did you learn that? What you did?" She considered the question. Not whether to answer. She wasn't particularly secretive. But how to answer accurately. "A woman I knew when I was young," she said. She wasn't a trained healer. She didn't have a title. But she understood plants and wounds and the way curses sit in the body differently than natural injury. A pause. "She taught me what she knew." "Who was she?" "She's dead," Mabel said, not coldly, simply. "She died when I was 17. Aiden was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "You didn't know her." "No." His eyes stayed on her face. "But you did." Mabel looked at him steadily. It was a strange thing for a king to say. Or at least she imagined it was. She had no particular experience with kings. She had experience with men who held power over other people. And in that experience they rarely acknowledged the weight of small losses, unless those losses were their own. "Your healer," she said, redirecting. "Drost." He was using the right compound for a normal wound. He couldn't have known it was ash iron. "I know." Aiden's jaw shifted slightly. "He'll be compensated." "I wasn't defending him." She tilted her head. "I was explaining. There's a difference." Castor made a small sound from the corner. She wasn't sure if it was disapproval or something else. 25 healers, Aiden said, echoing what Castor had said earlier. 6 days, every one of them trained, titled, experienced. He looked at his own hands, large hands she noticed, with the kind of fine scars across the knuckles that came not from carelessness, but from long practice. And a waitress in a mountain inn solved it in under a minute. "I had the right herbs available," Mabel said, "and I've seen an ash iron wound before. That's not skill. That's circumstance. You knew what to look for. Yes. That's skill, he said. Quiet. Certain. She didn't argue the point. She had learned that arguing with people about their own certainties was usually a waste of both parties' time. Why were you on the road? She asked instead. The King's Road through Crestfall doesn't go anywhere important. It's a market route. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Castor didn't move. The sleeping boy didn't stir. But the air changed slightly, the way it changed before rain, a subtle shift in pressure. I was told it was the safest route, Aiden said. Mabel looked at him. Who told you that? His expression gave her nothing, but his silence gave her something. A particular quality of silence. The kind that meant the question had landed somewhere significant. My advisor, he said after a moment. And where is your advisor now? Another pause. Longer. That's a good question, he said quietly. She thought about the wound again. The clean edge and the ragged edge. The specific combination of ash and iron, which was not something you found by accident. You found it by intention. She thought about 25 trained healers who had all failed, all using the same standard treatments, none of them apparently told what the weapon had been. She thought about a route through a mountain market town that had been described as safe. She kept all of this to herself, because it was not her business, and she was a waitress who served tables and had a room above the kitchen and a life that fit neatly inside its own borders. She had built those borders carefully. She had reasons for them. You should sleep, she said, standing. The wound will hold tonight, but your body needs rest to finish what I started. Don't let anyone apply anything else to it. No compounds, no poultices. Just leave it. Aiden looked up at her from the table. She was standing now and he was sitting, which meant for once she was the taller one, and something about that seemed to interest him. Mabel, he said. My lord. She wasn't sure what the correct title was. It seemed to do. I need to ask something of you. She waited. I need to move through this valley for the next 3 days, he said. There are things that need to be done here. Business that can't wait. His voice was even, but underneath the evenness, she could hear the faint strain of a man who had spent 6 days injured and was not accustomed to being at a disadvantage. And it appears that whoever arranged my injury is still somewhere in this valley. Which means I may need someone who understands cursed wounds. He paused. Someone who isn't already part of my circle. The fire in the main hall had gone almost completely to coals. The wind outside had picked up. Mabel could feel the cold coming through the gap at the base of the door, threading across the stone floor around her boots. You want me to stay close, she said. I want you to be available, he corrected, if needed. I'm a waitress, she said, for the 3rd time since she'd met him. I serve tables. I know what you are. He said it exactly as he'd said it in the corridor, with the same weight, the same quiet certainty. But this time something else was underneath it. Not quite a question, but the shape of one. As though he knew she was more than she was saying, and was choosing not to press it. Not yet. I'll think about it, she said. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the frame when she heard Castor's voice from the corner. Low, not quite directed at her, but not directed away from her either. You should know, he said, that the last person who helped him is currently missing. Mabel's hand stayed on the frame. She didn't turn around. I know, she said, and walked out. She lay awake in her small room above the kitchen for a long time that night, listening to the wind work at the shutters. The wool blanket was thick, and the straw mattress was familiar under her back, and the room smelled of old wood and the faint ghost of kitchen smoke that never fully left the upper floor. She stared at the ceiling. The last person who helped him is currently missing. She thought about borders, about the careful, quiet life she had built inside them, about how 4 years at the Iron Bell had been exactly enough time to begin believing that the life she used to live, the one before Crestfall, before the inn, before Petra and Garrett and the smell of pine smoke, was something that belonged to a different person entirely. She thought about the woman who had taught her about cursed wounds, about ash iron, about the specific, quiet knowledge that had no title and earned no recognition and sat in Mabel's hands like something she'd never asked to carry. She thought about a king who had said please. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters with that low, persistent sound. She closed her eyes. By morning, she had decided. She told Rolf she needed 3 days. The innkeeper looked at her across the kitchen counter with the expression of a man who had long since learned that Mabel did not make requests she hadn't already decided on. He was a wide, slow-moving man in his 50s, with a gray beard and hands like bread loaves, and he had hired her 4 years ago, based on nothing more than the steadiness of her eyes and the fact that she had asked a fair wage rather than a desperate one. In his experience, people who knew their own worth caused fewer problems than people who didn't. 3 days, he repeated. I'll cover the cost of a temporary girl from the market, she said, and I'll work double shifts when I return. Rolf looked past her toward the private hall, where the sounds of the king's men preparing to move had been filtering through the walls since before dawn. Boots on stone, low voices, the creak and jingle of horses being readied in the yard behind the inn. This about the man they brought in last night? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and produced a small cloth bundle. Bread, dried meat, something wrapped in paper that turned out to be salt cheese when she checked it later. He set it on the counter in front of her without a word. Mabel picked it up. Thank you, Rolf. Don't get killed, he said, which was the most sentiment she had ever heard him express, and went back to his bread. The morning was the particular gray-white of early mountain winter, the sky pressed low and heavy, the air carrying the smell of coming snow. Mabel came out through the inn's side door with her bundle and a worn canvas pack over one shoulder, a change of clothes, her herb kit wrapped in oilcloth, a small knife she'd carried for years in a sheath at her belt, mostly out of habit. She wore her heaviest wool dress under a dark cloak that had been good once and was still decent, and boots she'd resoled twice herself. She found Aidan standing in the yard beside a black horse. He looked different in the morning light, still large, still carrying that quality of banked authority that seemed to occupy space whether or not he was actively doing anything. But the borrowed linen shirt had been replaced with proper traveling clothes, dark wool and leather, a heavy cloak with a fur-lined collar. The wound on his side was covered. He moved with only a slight stiffness that a person wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. He was looking at the mountains when she came out. He turned when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. His eyes went to her pack, then to her face. You decided, he said. 3 days, she said. Then I go back to my tables. Something moved across his expression, too quick to name. 3 days, he agreed. Castor appeared from the other side of the horse with the expression of a man who had several opinions he was choosing not to voice. He looked at Mabel's pack, at her knife, at her general lack of anything resembling a formal healer's kit, and compressed his mouth into a thin line. She rides with the secondary group, he said to Aidan, not to her. Behind the main guard. She rides where she can be useful, Aidan said, in a tone that ended the conversation cleanly and without heat. Castor's mouth got slightly thinner. He walked away. Mabel looked at the horse Aidan was standing beside. It was a very large horse. She was a competent rider in the way that most people in mountain towns were competent riders, functional, unhurried, unlikely to fall off. But she had not ridden anything this large since she was a different person in a different life. Can you ride? Aidan asked. Yes. Well? She considered. Adequately. He looked at her for a moment. Adequately, he repeated, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Light, brief, gone almost immediately, like a crack of sun between clouds. He turned to the horse and adjusted the saddle strap with the ease of long habit. She noticed his hands again, the fine scars, the way he moved, careful but not slow, always aware of where everything was around him. Even injured, even in the ordinary act of adjusting a strap, there was something in his body that was permanently, quietly ready. She looked away and checked her pack instead. The valley road was narrow and pale with frost, threading between the pine-dark ridges toward the lower market settlements. The king's party traveled in a practiced formation. 4 guards forward, Aiden in the center with Castor close, 2 guards behind, and then Mabel on a smaller bay horse that Castor had procured for her, with an expression suggesting he found this arrangement personally offensive. Behind Mabel rode the boy. His name was Finn, she had learned, and he was 17 and had been Aiden's page for 8 months and had not slept properly in a week. He had dark circles under his eyes and a nervous habit of checking the tree line every few minutes that suggested the last 6 days had frightened him badly. He rode up alongside her after the first mile. "You're the waitress," he said, not unkindly, conversational, the statement of someone who had been thinking about how to begin this sentence for some time. "Yes," Mabel said. "You fixed what 25 healers couldn't." "I had the right information." Finn was quiet for a moment, his horse's breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Healer Drost has been with the court for 12 years. He's treated wolf fever, bone break wounds, poison arrows." He paused. "He cried a little last night, after you left. I don't think he meant anyone to see it." Mabel looked at the road ahead. "He shouldn't feel ashamed. Ash iron wounds are rare enough that most healers go their entire career without seeing one. The knowledge isn't common." "Where does the knowledge come from?" She thought of the woman again. The small house at the edge of the old wood. The smell of dried herbs and tallow candles and old paper. The patient hands guiding her smaller ones. "Not every wound announces what it is, Mabel. You have to ask the body. You have to listen. Old places," she said. "Old teachers." Finn seemed to accept this. He rode in silence for a moment, then said, "The advisor who told him the mountain road was safe. His name is Edric. He's been with the court for 3 years." Another pause. "He wasn't in his rooms this morning when they went to find him." Mabel kept her face neutral. "I see." "Castor thinks you should know," Finn said carefully. "He didn't want to tell you himself because he doesn't entirely trust you yet, but he thought you should know." She glanced at the boy. He had an honest face, the kind that found deception slightly uncomfortable, even when executing it on someone else's behalf. "Tell Castor I appreciate the information," she said, "and that I don't trust him yet either, so we're even." Finn blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, too loud for the quiet valley road. 3 guards glanced back. Aiden ahead turned slightly. Mabel looked straight ahead and said nothing. They stopped at midday in a sheltered hollow where the road widened and an old stone waymarker stood half buried in frozen moss. The guards built a small fire. Someone produced travel bread and dried meat, and Mabel sat on a fallen log and ate her salt cheese and watched the tree line the way Finn had been doing all morning, because old habits did not disappear, just because you had spent 4 years convincing yourself you didn't need them. Aiden sat beside her. Not beside her as in next to a fire, beside her specifically on the same fallen log, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even through 2 layers of wool. The guards noticed, and very carefully did not look. "Tell me about the woman who taught you," he said. Mabel looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because I've been trying to understand something since last night." He held a piece of travel bread in his scarred hands, unhurried. 25 healers, 6 days, all of them trained in formal traditions, guild knowledge, court medicine. He looked at her. "And the one person who knew the answer Learned it from a woman with no title, in what I'm guessing was not a formal setting. A small house, Mabel said, before she decided to. At the edge of a wood, when I was 12. How did you come to be there? She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere up the ridge, a branch gave under the weight of early frost and fell through other branches with a slow, cascading sound. My mother brought me, she said. She was sick. Not with something a guild healer could help. The woman in the wood was the only one who knew how. A pause. She saved my mother, and then she let me stay, because I kept coming back and asking questions, and she said she'd rather teach me than keep chasing me off her doorstep. She sounds formidable. She was stubborn, Mabel said, which is close. Aiden was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. What happened to her? Mabel looked at the fire. She knew things that made certain people uncomfortable, she said. People with titles. People who preferred that the kind of knowledge she had stayed in the guild system where it could be controlled. She paused. One winter she was gone. Her house was there. Her things were there. She was gone. The word sat between them in the cold air. Aiden said nothing for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but heavier, like a stone moved to cover something. How old were you? 17. And then you came to Crestfall. Not directly, she said. Not for a while. She looked at her hands. But eventually, yes. She could feel him looking at her profile. She didn't turn. Mabel, he said. You're going to ask me something I won't answer, she said. Not yet. A pause. How do you know? Because you've been building toward it since we sat down, she said. And whatever it is, it's something you've been carrying for longer than this conversation. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. Not uncomfortable, but full. Like a room where someone has just lit a lamp and the light is still settling. Fair enough, Aiden said quietly. He stood, brushing frost from his cloak. For now. They reached the first settlement, a cluster of long houses and a market square called Duncairn. By late afternoon, when the light had gone the pale gold of a sun too tired to warm anything. The smell of wood smoke was thick in the air. And somewhere ahead, someone was rendering tallow. And beneath both of those smells was something else. Something faint and sharp that Mabel caught the moment they rode into the square, and that made her sit straighter in her saddle. Castor appeared at her left stirrup. What is it? She hadn't realized she'd reacted visibly. She looked at him. The anvil jaw, the cold riverstone eyes. And she said, Who in this settlement was Edric supposed to meet? Castor went very still. How did you... The smell, she said simply. Ash and iron, very faint. It's been here more recently than the wound. She looked at the square, the long houses, the market stalls being folded and covered for the evening, the ordinary faces of ordinary people moving through the end of an ordinary day. He came through here. Maybe he's still here. Castor looked at Aiden. Aiden was looking at Mabel, and in his expression, the storm and amber eyes, the still water depth of them, she saw the question he had been building toward finally surface. Not spoken. Not yet. But there, clear and present and waiting. Who are you, really? She looked away first. They found Edric's horse first. It was tied behind the tallow-maker's shed at the far end of the market square. A pale gray mare with the Royal Stable brand on her left flank, still saddled, still bridled, her breath coming in anxious clouds in the cold air. She had been there long enough that her hooves had shifted and stamped the frozen mud into small, uneven ruts, but not so long that she'd stopped looking toward the road. Castor sent 2 guards around the back of the shed. 2 more took the alley between the long houses. Aiden dismounted without being asked, which made Castor say his name in a low, sharp tone that suggested this was a recurring argument between them. Aidan looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had heard the argument many times and still intended to do exactly what he was going to do. Mabel dismounted too. Nobody told her to stay back. She suspected that was an oversight she would hear about later. The tallow maker's shed was small and warm, and smelled powerfully of rendered fat and wood ash. A man of perhaps 50 stood in the doorway with his hands raised, and an expression of pure bewilderment on his round face. One of the guards was already questioning him. Low, fast, clipped sentences. The man kept shaking his head. The horse arrived this morning. Finn translated from a few steps behind Mabel, having apparently been following along. A man paid him to keep it, paid well, said he'd be back for it by nightfall. Description? Castor demanded. The tallow maker spoke. Finn translated. Medium height, dark cloak. He says the man's hands were wrapped, both of them, in linen. Mabel's attention sharpened on that last detail. She looked at Aidan, who was standing just inside the shed doorway, with the still water expression that she was beginning to understand was not blankness, but the opposite, a very full kind of quiet, the kind that meant he was processing several things at once and choosing which ones to address first. Wrapped hands, she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Aidan looked at her. Ash iron leaves residue, she said. If you handle the weapon without protection, it marks the skin. It doesn't wash off easily. You'd cover it. You can track him by it? Castor asked. Not track. She considered. But if I see him, I'll know. Castor looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression she had come to recognize. The one that was slowly, reluctantly, and against his apparent preference, shifting from suspicion toward something more like grudging assessment. He looked at Aidan. Something passed between them without words. Castor walked away to organize the search of the settlement. Aidan stayed. They were standing just outside the shed now, in the narrow strip of space between the building and the alley wall, the cold pressing in from both sides, the pale gold light now almost entirely gone from the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear over the eastern ridge, faint, distant, the particular cold light of stars seen through mountain air. 3 years, Aidan said. Mabel looked at him. Edric has been in my court for 3 years, he continued. His voice was even, controlled, the evenness of something held firmly. He was recommended by my second counsel. He came with references. He knew the court's language, the court's systems. He made himself useful in ways that were always just visible enough to notice. A pause. I trusted him. Mabel said nothing. She had learned that the moments when powerful people admitted to being deceived were fragile ones. They didn't need her commentary. They needed to be allowed to exist. I should have seen it, he said. People show you what they've prepared to show you, Mabel said. Seeing through a prepared performance is not the same as failure. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something slightly unguarded, a hairline fracture in the still water surface. You sound like you know something about that. She looked at the first stars. I know something about most things I talk about, she said. That's why I'm careful about what I talk about. A silence. Then quietly, what aren't you telling me, Mabel? The question landed without weight, without demand. It was just a question, asked in the tone of a man who was genuinely asking rather than maneuvering toward something. That quality, the genuine rather than the strategic, was the thing about him she had found most disorienting from the beginning, because it didn't match what she expected, and she hadn't yet recalibrated for it. She turned to face him directly. He was close in the narrow space, and the warmth that came off him despite the cold was a wolf thing, she knew. the particular heat of a shifted nature banked under skin. She had been aware of it since the storage room without letting herself acknowledge it. "I'm from a border settlement called Ashfen," she said, "south of the Second Ridge. I lived there until I was 22. Then I came to Crestfall." She paused. "Ashfen was burned 2 years after I left. I don't know why. I don't know by whom. I came back, and it was gone." Her voice stayed flat. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it the way you felt an old break in a bone, dull and permanent. But because she had had years to learn how to carry it. "I don't talk about it because I haven't decided what to do about it yet." Aiden was very still. "Ashfen," he said. Something in how he said it made her look at him sharply. His expression had changed. The hairline fracture had widened into something she couldn't immediately read. Recognition. And underneath it, something heavier. Something that looked almost like grief. "You know it," she said. Not a question. "I knew of it," he said carefully. He looked away from her toward the darkening sky. And for a moment, she saw what he looked like underneath the authority and the controlled stillness. A man carrying something he hadn't set down in a long time. Ashfen was a settlement under old border protection. It fell under my predecessor's jurisdiction. When it burned... He stopped. "When it burned," she said. "There was an investigation," he said. "It was closed. Inconclusive." His jaw shifted. "I was newly come into my position. I was told it was a common settlement fire. I had 30 other crises demanding my attention, and He stopped again. The cold between them had changed texture. It was no longer just weather. "You let it be closed," Mabel said. "Yes." The word was quiet and carried its own weight. "I let it be closed." She breathed, in and out, the smell of tallow and wood smoke and frozen earth. She had not expected this. She had not expected to be standing in an alley in Duncairn hearing the Alpha King tell her that the burning of her home had been something he had the power to question, and had chosen not to. She had spent 2 years with that fire living in the back of her chest like an ember that never went out. She had built her life in Crestfall around it. The quiet room, the apron, the borders, partly because she had no answers, and partly because she had understood, in the way you understood things you would rather not, that asking the wrong questions in the wrong direction could make you disappear the way her teacher had disappeared. The way Edric's trail was trying to make her disappear. "Mabel," he said. "Don't," she said, not angrily, just clearly. He was quiet. "Not tonight," she said. "I need to think." He nodded once, slowly. "All right." She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the horses, and she did not let any of what she was feeling show in her shoulders or her stride, because she was very good at that, and she needed to be very good at that right now. They stayed the night in Duncairn's only inn, a low-ceilinged place that smelled of straw and old ale, and was significantly humbler than the Iron Bell, which Mabel found mildly gratifying in a way she couldn't entirely justify. She was given a room that was mostly a closet with a cot in it, which suited her. Finn got the room next to hers, and she could hear him turning over and over on his creaking mattress for an hour before he finally went still. She did not sleep at all. She lay on her back on the narrow cot in the dark and let herself feel, carefully and in controlled measure, the thing she had been keeping at arm's length since the alley conversation. Not betrayal. He hadn't owed her anything. He hadn't known her. He had been a newly ascended king with 30 crises. She understood all of that intellectually, and her feelings had never been particularly interested in what she understood intellectually. The ember in her chest was still there. It was always still there. She had it in her hands, held carefully, not fed, not starved, when she heard the sound. Faint. Below her window. The particular quality of a footstep trying not to be a footstep on frozen ground. She was at the window in 4 seconds without making a sound, because old habits, as she had already established, did not disappear just because you tried to leave them behind. She looked through the gap in the shutter. In the strip of moonlight between the inn and the stable, a figure in a dark cloak was moving with purpose in the direction of Aiden's room. Both hands were wrapped in white linen. Mabel had her boots on and was in the corridor in the time it took to breathe twice. She didn't shout. Shouting woke everyone, caused panic, gave a prepared person the time to recalibrate. Instead, she moved fast and quiet down the back stair and through the side door and around the corner of the inn in the cold dark, her breath tight and controlled, the small knife at her belt suddenly present in her awareness in a way it hadn't been in 4 years. She came around the corner of the stable at the exact moment the figure reached Aiden's ground floor shutter. "Don't," she said. The figure froze. In the moonlight, she could see what he was holding. Not a blade. A small clay vial, the kind used for contact poison, pressed against a wound. It wouldn't need to be opened. Just touched to the skin above the site she had closed the night before. Clever. Patient. The wound looked healed. Nobody would think to check. The figure turned. She had expected Edric to look like a villain. The body had a way of telling you, after the fact, that there had been signs. But the face that turned toward her in the moonlight was ordinary. Tired, middle-aged. The face of a man who had made a series of decisions and arrived, through them, at a place he might not have originally intended to be. "Step away from the window," she said. "You're a waitress," Edric said. His voice was almost confused. "You're nobody. Step away from the window." He moved instead, toward her, fast, the vial still in his hand, reaching for her wrist. She sidestepped the way the woman in the wood had taught her, putting her weight into the stone wall and letting his momentum carry him past her. And then Castor was there, because Castor had apparently not been sleeping either, and 2 guards behind him. And Edric was on the ground in the frozen mud with his arms pinned before the vial had finished rolling across the cobblestones. Mabel picked up the vial carefully, by the base, not the top, and held it. Aiden was in the doorway. He had come out at the sound, his cloak pulled over his shoulders, his eyes finding Mabel first, and then the scene in the yard. His expression went through several things quickly, and settled on something controlled and very cold. Castor looked up from where he had Edric pinned. He looked at Mabel. He looked at the vial in her careful hand. He looked back at Aiden. "She was awake," Castor said, with the tone of a man updating a significant file in his mind. "She heard him before any of us." "Yes," Aiden said. His eyes were on Mabel. "She did." Edric made a sound that was almost a laugh from the frozen ground. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I'm not the end of this. I'm not even the beginning. The order was placed long before you rode out of the Iron Veil, my lord." He said the title with a flatness that stripped it of all its weight. "There are people in your court who want you gone. People who were there before you and will be there after." "Who?" Castor said. But Edric's eyes, muddy and tired in the moonlight, had moved to Mabel. "Ask her," he said. "Ask her about Ashfin. Ask her who gave the order to burn it. Ask her why the woman in the wood had to disappear." His voice dropped. "Ask her how deep this goes." The yard was very quiet. The cold was total. Somewhere on the ridge above the settlement, a night bird called once and went silent. Mabel stood with the vial in her hands and felt every pair of eyes in that yard turn toward her, including Aiden's. She met his gaze, storm and amber, the still water depth of it. "I think," she said very calmly, "that we need to have that conversation now." They sat in the inn's common room with the fire rebuilt and the doors closed. Castor stood by the entrance. Finn had been sent back to his room, not unkindly, but firmly, in the way you sent someone away when what was about to be said was not something a 17-year-old needed to carry. Edric was secured in the stable under guard, the clay vial wrapped in oilcloth and locked in Castor's travel chest. Outside, the wind had come down from the ridge and was moving through the settlement in long, low sweeps, pressing against the shutters with that persistent asking sound that Mabel had been hearing since the Iron Bell, since before the Iron Bell, since most of her life. She sat across the fire from Aiden and told him everything. Not because Edric had forced her hand, though he had, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it, but because standing in that yard with the vial in her hands and the cold on her face and his eyes finding her first in the dark, she had felt something shift inside her the way ice shifted on a river in early spring. Not breaking, just moving, just beginning to acknowledge that the thaw was already underway whether she managed it or not. She told him about Ashvin. The real Ashvin, not the border settlement that had burned in an inconclusive fire, but the community underneath that description, the one that had maintained old knowledge, old traditions of healing that predated the guild system by 2 centuries. Not magic in the dramatic sense, simply knowledge that had been passed from hand to hand across generations. Knowledge the guilds had been trying to absorb or eliminate for 40 years, because knowledge outside their system was knowledge outside their control. She told him about the woman in the wood, whose name had been Soren, and who had not disappeared by accident, who had been quietly erased because she had been teaching, because she had students, because the network of old knowledge was still alive, and someone had decided it needed to end. She told him that Soren had left her something before she vanished. Not an object, a name, written on a scrap of paper that Mabel had memorized and then burned, because Soren had taught her that paper could be found, and memory could not be taken by force. The name was not Edric's. Edric was, as he had said himself, not the beginning. He was a courier, a tool. A man who had been in debt to someone powerful and had agreed to a series of small, manageable-seeming tasks that had accumulated, over 3 years, into a shape he perhaps hadn't seen until he was already inside it. The name Soren had left her was a name from Aiden's first council, a woman named Hessa, who had been on the second council when the investigation into Ashvin had been closed, and who had since moved to the first, who had been present in 3 kingdoms' worth of political negotiations over the past decade, who appeared in documents relating to guild charter expansions in 6 different provinces, who had recommended Edric to the court. Aiden sat very still through all of this. The fire moved in the hearth beside them. The wind moved outside. He sat with his elbows on his knees, and his scarred hands loosely linked, and his expression doing the thing she had come to understand, was not blankness, but fullness, holding more than it showed. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "You've known this," he said, "or suspected it. For how long?" "The name since I was 17, she said. "The shape of it, how far it went. I've been piecing that together for longer than I've been at the Iron Bell." She paused. "I came to Crestfall because it was close to the second ridge, and because I thought if I kept myself small and unremarkable in the right place, eventually the shape would become clear enough to act on. You were building toward something. I was waiting until I had enough." She looked at her hands. A woman alone with a name and a dead teacher is not a credible source. She's a story. She disappears. She met his eyes. "I needed something more than what I had." Aiden looked at her for a long time. "And now?" "Now Edric is in your stable," she said. "And Edric has been in your court for 3 years, and has been coordinating actions against you from the inside, which gives you grounds to investigate the full length of what he was doing and who gave him direction." She paused. "That's considerably more than a woman with a name." Something moved across his face, not quite the almost smile from before. Something quieter and more serious than that, and somehow more significant. "You were never just waiting," he said. "You were protecting yourself until you could do something that would actually land." "Yes. That's not waiting," he said. "That's strategy." She said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind swept through and then eased, as though it had finally been let in and found what it was looking for. "Mabel," Aiden said. She looked up. "I'm going to open the investigation into Ashfen," he said. "Not as a favor, not as a negotiation. It should have been opened 2 years ago and it wasn't, and He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I'm going to open it." She breathed through the ember in her chest, in and out. It was still there. It would probably always be there in some form. But something around it was different now. Not gone, but given space, given air, given the acknowledgement that it had a right to exist in the first place. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, simple and complete. He nodded once. And then quietly, "I should have said them to you first." The investigation into Edric's activities began within the week. He was transported to the Iron Vale under heavy guard, with Castor personally overseeing the journey. He talked in the end. Not immediately, not easily. But he talked. Because the alternative was worse, and because the people he'd been protecting had never particularly protected him. He confirmed Hessa's involvement. He confirmed the network of guild-backed pressure that had been operating in the court for a decade. He confirmed that the order to burn Ashfen had come from a consortium of 3 guild masters who had wanted the old knowledge community eliminated and had routed the commission through court channels to keep their own names distant from it. He confirmed that Soren had been taken, that she had not simply disappeared. Mabel received this information in a letter that Finn delivered to the Iron Bell 3 weeks after she had returned to her tables, to Rolf's bread-scented kitchen, to Petra's steady presence, and Garrett's complaints about ale temperature, and the pine smoke, and the mountain wind, and the familiar weight of the apron in her hands. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress and went back to work, because the tables needed covering, and the dinner crowd was arriving, and some things could only be processed in motion. That night, alone in her room with the wool blanket pulled up and the sounds of the inn settling around her, she let herself grieve Soren properly for the first time. Not the fragmented grief of uncertainty, gone, maybe, somehow, but the whole grief of knowing. It was heavier and cleaner at the same time. It had edges. It had a shape. And things with shapes could eventually be carried rather than simply endured. She cried for a while. Then she stopped. Then she slept better than she had in 4 years. Hessa was removed from the first council 2 months later, quietly and entirely. Her position dissolved and her documents seized before she had understood what direction the investigation had turned. 3 guild masters were formally charged. The investigation into Ashfen was reopened and given a dedicated commissioner. Surviving members of the old knowledge community, there were more of them than Mabel had known, scattered across border settlements and small towns, quietly maintaining what they maintained, were contacted and given formal protected status under a new provision in the territorial charter. It was not everything. It was not justice in the complete, clean sense that grief sometimes imagined justice could be. But it was real, and it was documented. And it could not be quietly closed by someone in a position of convenient authority. Mabel learned all of this in stages, through letters that arrived at the Iron Bell in envelopes bearing the Iron Vale seal. She read each one at the kitchen counter with her morning tea, and she wrote responses that were precise and factual, and gave Rolf no indication of their content. And she filed them in the small wooden box she kept under her cot, alongside the oilcloth-wrapped herb kit. The last letter came in early spring, when the snow on the ridge had begun to recede and the pine trees were releasing their cold smell into air that was finally, tentatively beginning to warm. It was longer than the others. It was not from Finn, who had written most of the updates with his earnest, honest handwriting and his tendency to include small observations about the weather and what the horses were doing. It was from Aiden. It was not a long letter. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who used more words than a thing required. He wrote that the investigation had reached its formal conclusions. He wrote that the protected status provision had been signed and was now in effect. He wrote that Edric had been sentenced, and that the sentence had been carried out, and that this particular thread was closed. And then he wrote, at the bottom of the page, in slightly different handwriting, as though it had been added separately and after consideration, "I find that I think about a conversation in an alley in Duncairn more often than is probably efficient. If you're willing, I would like to finish it. There is no obligation in this. There is no expectation. There is only the question, which I think you already know, and which I would like to ask properly, whenever you're ready. Or never, if that's what you decide. And I mean that." She read it 4 times. Then she set it down and drank her tea, and looked out the kitchen window at the pale early spring sky above the ridge, and thought about Borders. About the careful, quiet life she had built inside them. About how she had built them to survive, and how surviving was not the same thing as living. A distinction she had been aware of for some time, and had mostly been too tired to do anything about. She thought about Storm and Amber eyes. About a man who said please and meant it. About a scarred hand on her wrist in a lamplit storage room, and a voice like gravel that had carried her name as though it had been waiting somewhere to be spoken aloud. She thought about Soren, who had taught her that the body knew things before the mind admitted them. She thought about the ember in her chest, still there, still present, but smaller now, and warm rather than burning, and surrounded by enough air that it no longer crowded everything else out. She picked up the letter and held it. Then she went to find Rolf. She told him she needed a leave of absence. She didn't know how long. Rolf looked at her for a moment across the kitchen counter with the same expression as always. Unhurried, unflappable. The expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that the world moved whether he managed it or not. Then he reached under the counter and produced a small cloth bundle. Bread, dried meat, salt cheese. "Rolf," she said. "Don't get killed," he said, and went back to his bread. Petra, who had been listening from the doorway, met Mabel's eyes across the kitchen and said nothing, just lifted her chin slightly, the particular gesture that meant good, and it's about time, and be careful all in one motion. Mabel nodded back. She went upstairs and packed her canvas bag, the change of clothes, the oilcloth herb kit, the wooden box with the letters in it, the small knife in its sheath. She paused at the door of her room and looked back at it. The narrow cot, the wool blanket, the shuttered window, the smell of old wood and kitchen smoke. 4 years. It had been a good room. It had been exactly what she needed when she needed it, which was a thing she had come to understand was worth something, even when what you needed was small and quiet and carefully bordered. She closed the door. She arrived at the Iron Vale on the 4th day of travel, when the mountains had given way to rolling lowland, and the road had widened, and the air had changed from pine to something older and earthier, the smell of deep soil and open distance. The gates were open. Finn was waiting in the courtyard with 2 horses, and a wide, genuine smile, and the particular brightness of a young man who had been given good news, and was trying to contain it with only partial success. He had apparently slept properly since she'd last seen him. He looked like a different person, or perhaps the same person with the fear removed, which amounted to much the same thing. "He's in the East Hall," Finn said. "He's been there since this morning." A pause. "He arrived early." Mabel looked at the gates, at the courtyard, at the stone walls of the vale rising around her, old and solid and permanent. "He knows I'm here?" she asked. "He knew before you reached the outer road," Finn said, with the slight awkwardness of someone referencing a wolf sense they were not sure how to explain politely. "He's been—" Another pause. "Patient," Finn finished carefully. "Very patient." She almost smiled. She handed her horse's reins to Finn and walked toward the East Hall. Aidan was standing at the window when she came in. The room was large and warm, a fire in the stone hearth, the smell of wood and old paper, and the specific scent she had catalogued in a storage room a season ago, and had not been able to entirely put out of her mind since. He turned when he heard her step. He looked the same, broader in a room with a proper ceiling. The storm and amber eyes finding her immediately and staying there with that quality of fullness, of the still water depth running through to wherever still water ran. He did not say you came. It would have been the obvious thing. He didn't say it. You wanted to finish a conversation, she said. I did. He crossed the room slowly and stopped at a distance that was respectful and present at the same time. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, that wolf heat banked under skin. You already know the question. Ask it properly, she said. You said you wanted to ask it properly. Something moved in his face, the hairline fracture, the almost smile, wider now, more certain, less almost. Will you stay? He asked. Simple, direct. No architecture around it, no qualifications, no careful political framing. Just the question, offered with both hands, with no demand inside it, and no performance of certainty he didn't have. Not permanently if that's not what you want. Not on any terms other than your own, but a breath. Will you stay? Mabel looked at him. She looked at the room, the fire, the window with its view of the open lowland distance beyond the vale walls. She thought of Soren, who had taught her to listen to what the body already knew. She thought of borders built for survival. She thought of what came after surviving. Yes, she said. The word was simple and complete and final in the way that true things were final, not closed, but settled, the way a stone settled into earth, fitting its own shape into the ground that had been waiting for it. Aiden let out a long breath. It was not a dramatic thing, not a sweep or a declaration, just the breath of a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had now, quietly, set it down. He offered his hand, the scarred one, with the fine marks across the knuckles from long practice. She took it. Epilogue. The investigation's final report was published before summer. It named names, traced money, documented 3 decades of guild-backed suppression of old knowledge practices across 7 provinces. It was not comfortable reading for a number of people in positions of authority, which was precisely the point. The old knowledge community, those who had survived, scattered and careful, keeping what they knew in memory and in motion, began, slowly, to come together. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things that have been underground come up when the conditions change, steadily, toward the light. Mabel did not become a healer with a title. She had no interest in titles. She did eventually begin teaching, small groups, in a room in the east wing that Aiden set aside for it without being asked, because he had been paying attention. She taught what Soren had taught her, and what her own 4 years of paying attention had added to it, and she taught it the way Soren had taught her, patiently, practically, without mysticism, to anyone who showed up at the door and asked questions and kept coming back. Finn showed up at the door in the 2nd month. He was a poor student at first and became a good one, which was more or less what Mabel had expected. Castor never came to the room, but he began, at some point that Mabel could not precisely identify, to stop standing between her and wherever she was going. It was the closest thing to an apology she expected from him, and she found it entirely sufficient. Edric's sentencing stood. The 3 guildmasters faced formal proceedings. Hessa, stripped of her position and her documents, left the Vale, and was not heard from again in any capacity that mattered. The ember in Mabel's chest did not disappear. She had stopped expecting it to. Grief did not resolve into nothing. It resolved into something smaller and more manageable, something you could hold rather than something that held you. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. In late summer, when the valley below the Iron Vale was gold and green, and the air smelled of warm grass and distant rain, Aiden found her in the East Wing room after her students had gone, sitting at the table with the oilcloth herb kit open in front of her and a piece of paper covered in her small, precise handwriting. She was documenting what she knew, systematically, thoroughly, in language that was clear enough to be learned from without her in the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Soren did this," she said, without looking up. "Wrote it down. Left records. That's partly why she was dangerous to them." She paused. "So I'm doing it again. Better. This time. More copies. More hands." He crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers, and looked at the page without speaking. She kept writing. He stayed. Outside, the summer light moved across the valley in long gold sweeps, and the grass bent in a wind that smelled of coming rain, and the world was not fixed. It was never entirely fixed, but it was changed, and changing still, in the slow, permanent way of things that had shifted at their roots. The woman who had served tables in a mountain inn and carried old knowledge in her hands and an ember in her chest had found, without quite planning for it, exactly what came after surviving. She kept writing. He stayed. The light moved across the valley. And that, in the end, was how it settled. Not with a proclamation, not with a grand gesture, but with two people in a warm room and work worth doing, and the particular quiet of a life that had finally, honestly, become their own.